Welcome to another episode of our video series of the Philosophical History with Contemporary Critique.
It's good to be here. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Preparing for this, I kept thinking about how much of our daily lives are spent just looking at projections.
Yes. Running on shadows, you could say. It's a perfect lead-in, actually.
It really is. So today we're jumping into some foundational, ancient, philosophical ideas about truth, about perception, and, well, the really difficult journey it takes to get to some kind of genuine understanding.
And these aren't just abstract ideas. The sources we're looking at are very specific. They explore what it actually takes for someone to break free from the reality they've always accepted.
Right, it's like they're mapping the very architecture of that illusion, the rules of a game you don't even realize you're playing.
And that's the mission here. The texts are so clear that real knowledge isn't something you just get passively. It's not enforced education. It's a necessary, sometimes painful, and totally active shift in how you see the world, how you understand causality.
So we're going to break down the mechanics of that cognitive leap, and then look at the pretty serious ethical and political fallout when someone tries to bring that knowledge back to everyone else.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, inside this illusion. The initial problem is a basic error in physics, really. The people inside are confusing cause and effect.
That's the heart of it. They see a shadow move on the wall, and their mind just immediately concludes that the shadow's movement is the cause of everything. They've inverted the entire causal chain.
And they're trapped by that idea, not by, physical chains alone. The chains are almost secondary.
The chains are secondary to the cognitive trap. And this is why, as the sources point out, just using sheer force it's useless.
You can't just run in there and knock down the wall.
Right. Or drag them out. It's epistemologically worthless. You might blind them for a second, confuse them, but the moment you let go, their mind snaps right back to the old model because they haven't understood the system.
The understanding has to come from them. It has to be self-initiated.
Precisely. The breakthrough requires what the sources call praxis, active intervention, practice. The only way for the prisoner to solve the relationship between the light source, the object, and the shadow is to do something.
An experiment.
A practical experiment. They have to step in, move their own hand in front of the light, maybe pick up one of the objects, and see in real time how their action directly affects the shadow on the wall.
It's that feeling of getting under the hood of a car versus just watching a video about it. You have to touch it.
You have to. It's kinetic knowledge. And the cognitive step that happens there is fascinating. It's not just about looking at the shadow or looking at the object.
It's about looking at both at the same time.
Yes. It's the ability to compare them simultaneously. Your eye, a camera, it just sees data points. It sees the object. It sees the shadow. But the brain, the intellect, that's what synthesizes the two.
That's the function that establishes the correct causal link.
That is the function. Without that active comparison, you stay trapped. Your eyesight could be perfect, but you'd still be a prisoner of the system.
And that idea of comparing realities is such a powerful bridge to today. The sources really draw a straight line from that scenario to us as spectators of media, of cinema. We're sitting in a dark room watching projections.
It leads to this incredibly deep critique of representation itself. I mean, if you accept the premise that the physical world we see is already a kind of shadow of a truer ideal form,
So what is the artist doing?
the artist is making a copy of a copy, a shadow of a shadow.
Which can feel a little bleak for anyone in a creative field.
It can, but there is that counter-argument, which is that art can guide us to the truth, maybe by showing us the very mechanism of the illusion.
Okay, but this is where modern stories seem to take a different path.
Yeah.
You think of these big sci-fi narratives, the famous ones about living in a simulation. The sources point out that our enjoyment of those films comes from a very specific feeling.
It's the feeling of being in on the secret, the key.
We get pleasure from knowing the truth while the characters don't. It makes us feel, a bit superior.
Exactly. The movie gives you the answer on a platter. Now, contrast that with the ancient allegory we're discussing. That story is also a copy, a metaphor, but its whole purpose is to push you, the listener, beyond the story itself.
It doesn't give you the key.
It refuses to. It puts all the responsibility for interpretation and action right back on you. The story's goal is to make itself obsolete once you've understood the principle.
That's a huge difference. So, okay, the prisoner solves the first system fire, puppet, wall. They have the breakthrough. Then comes the second stage, the ascent, and it's painful.
The pain is crucial. They're dragged outside, their eyes physically hurt from the sun, and the first instinct is to just retreat. Go back to the dark, to what's comfortable and familiar.
We all do that when we face a truth that challenges a core belief.
Absolutely. And the learning process outside isn't instant. The sources lay it out in very deliberate stages.
First, they see reflections in water.
Which is just a brilliant detail. A reflection uses a similar optical principle to a shadow, but it introduces color and real-world complexity. It's a stepping stone.
And then from there, they can look at actual objects, like a bird in the sky, then the stars at night, and only then, finally, can they look at the sun itself.
And this introduces a whole new problem to solve. The prisoner now has to figure out the relationship between, say, the real flying animal outside and the puppet of it they saw inside.
And the old methods don't work anymore.
The old methods are insufficient. Stretching out your hand, playing with optics, that only gets you so far. To understand a living thing, you need to understand, well, life.
This is where the sun becomes more than just a light source.
It becomes the regulator of the entire system. It's not a light bulb, it's the engine. The sources stress that the sun's cycle governs everything: temperature, seasons, migration, mating, feeding.
So understanding the sun means understanding the entire natural order. You go from a simple causal chain to a vast, interconnected ecosystem.
It's the ultimate reference point for all of life.
Okay, so this enlightened figure has gone through all of this. They've solved both the small system and the grand system. And now comes the real test. They go back.
The return. And it's a tragedy.
Their eyes aren't used to the dark anymore. They stumble around. They're terrible at the old shadow-identifying games the prisoners play.
They're mocked. They're seen as useless, broken.
And the sources are chillingly clear on the risk here. If this person tries to free the others by force, to drag them out like they were, what happens?
They'll be killed. Without question. They'd be seen as a dangerous lunatic trying to destroy everyone's reality.
Which implies that this kind of mass, sudden enlightenment is just. It's impossible, likely fatal.
You cannot force understanding. And this is the central problem of education, isn't it? If force doesn't work, what is the responsibility of the person who knows?
It has to be a relationship.
A reciprocal one. You have to respect where the learner is. You have to calibrate the lesson to them. It's about persuasion, not a top-down decree.
But then you get to the most profound challenge, I think. What if the person who returns decides not to liberate anyone? What if they use their superior knowledge to manipulate the others, to gain power? The sources call this knavery.
The enlightened propagandist. It's the ultimate danger. And the ancient philosophical defense against it is, well, it's fascinating. They argue that evil is inherently self-limiting.
How does that work? Why can't a manipulator just win indefinitely?
Because total, consistent malice and mistrust eventually paralyze everything. Think about it. For even two manipulators, two knaves, to team up to trick a third person, they need a basic level of trust between themselves.
They have to trust that their partner in crime won't betray them first.
Exactly. If there is absolute paranoid mistrust, no social action can happen. Not collaboration, not commerce, not even coordinated deception. It all grinds to a halt. So the argument goes that pure knavery is structurally unstable over the long term.
It's an interesting, maybe optimistic diffident.
Yeah.
And it connects directly to that modern argument you hear all the time. History is written by the powerful.
It's a form of relativism that can feel very paralyzing, as if we're all just prisoners of whatever narrative is being projected for us.
But the sources give us an intellectual tool to escape that.
They do. We are not trapped if we actively use our intellect to compare.
So for example, with a historical event, you don't just read the account from the victors.
You seek out the account from the vanquished, or from a neutral third party. You cross-reference the sources, and that very act of comparison is the same mental function as comparing the puppet and the shadow.
By putting two competing narratives next to each other, your mind can find a position that's independent of both.
Your mind achieves a kind of intellectual triangulation. That capacity is our way out of the tyranny of a single story.
And psychologically, what about the resistance to even trying? The sources suggest that deep pessimism or cynicism isn't just an outlook, it's a defense mechanism.
It's a preemptive shield, a way to protect yourself from the pain of disappointment. If you always expect the worst, you're never let down. It's an armor you build against the effort that truth requires.
Which leads to that ultimate trap, the Sisyphus fallacy. The idea that all our effort is absurd, that we push the rock up the hill just to watch it roll down, and we start from scratch every single time.
And that view is just fundamentally wrong about how experience works. Life isn't an arbitrary loop. We learn. The body adapts, the mind accumulates knowledge. The 10th time Sisyphus pushes that rock, he's stronger, he's smarter, his technique is better.
The effort is not the same. He isn't starting from scratch.
Never. The rock might fall, but he is changed by the effort. That cumulative learning completely debunks that kind of easy existential despair.
So to bring this all home, let's talk about the nature of dialogue itself, the kind of conversation we're trying to have. What keeps it moving forward isn't just agreement.
No, it's intellectual conflict. The friction of different ideas rubbing against each other is what keeps the central question alive. If everyone agrees immediately, the conversation is over, the system becomes static.
So that friction is necessary to keep us all comparing notes, to stop us from settling for an easy shadow on the wall.
It's vital.
Okay, so we've covered the need for active intervention for praxis. We've seen the dangers of the return, the failure of force, and the idea of truth as a comprehensive regulating system.
And if I were to synthesize it all, the core lesson is this. Knowledge demands active, practical engagement with complex systems. It's not passive. And the struggle to attain it comes with a huge ethical responsibility to navigate that difficult path between tyranny on one hand and manipulative knavery on the other.
That's a powerful way to put it. So instead of ending on the question that the sources say can sometimes limit us, what should we do? Maybe the better question for you, the listener, to take away is a different one. We should ask, what should we refrain from doing, knowing what we now know?
That's the question. The necessary restraint that makes ethical action possible? Something to think about as you navigate your own shadows and light.